Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a new EBD seminar. I'm María José Ruiz, and I'm going to be introducing our speaker today, and afterwards, Irene Mendoza will be moderating the questions. Before I introduce our speaker, just a couple of housekeeping reminders. If you need the certificate of attendance, please write your name in the chat and then send an email to seminars@ebd.csic.es. If you want to make questions to our speaker today, just write them down in the chat, and afterwards Irene will ask those questions. So our speaker today is Ana Benítez. She is a postdoctoral researcher at EBD. Her research, interests are in macroecology, biodiversity, conservation, and global change biology. Her research focuses on the factors that determine species distributions and abundance, and how these may be disrupted by anthropogenic factors. Her main scientific achievements include incorporating complex meta-analytical and predictive models to study the effect of global change drivers on species abundance patterns across large scales. Currently, she holds a Juan de la Cierva postdoctoral grant at Jordano's lab here at the EBD. And her main project aims at quantifying the ecological consequences of defaunation in the ecosystem functioning of tropical forests. Anna, without further ado, you can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mari. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thanks for the invitation. So today I will be speaking about the work I've been doing in the last 5 years or so, 4 or 5 years, on how to quantify and predict deformation across tropical forests and what consequences this may have for ecosystem functioning. So this is the outline of the seminar of today. First, I will discuss how to quantify predict hunting-induced deformation across the tropics. Then I will talk about how the combined effects of hunting and land use change may be altering mammals distribution. And then I will discuss the consequences of these changes for the vegetation composition in the tropics. So for those of you who don't know the concept of defaunation, is basically the loss of species and populations of wildlife, as well as local declines in abundance of individuals due to human activities. And one of the main signatures of this process is that it affects mostly the species of large body size. So for example, what you see here is a graph published by Dirso and others in Science a couple of years back, where they show that the species that went extinct in the Pleistocene were those with a larger body size compared to those that are extinct now in the area we're living, the Anthropocene. And in turn, these are species with larger body size than those that are threatened and non-threatened nowadays. What we know about this process is that the main drivers are habitat modification, as you see in the pie chart here on the right, and direct exploitation, which is the orange part. So I'll be talking first about the effects of direct exploitation or hunting. So hunting has been going on for millennia in tropical forests. Communities there depend a lot on wild meat for protein intake and also for making clothes and so on, and also for rituals and cultural events. But nowadays, this activity is becoming not sustainable anymore because of several reasons. One of them is that there's been a massive development of roads into previously remote areas, and that means that humans are now able to access areas that were previously isolated, and of course, they have access to the species that they live in these areas. This has been accompanied by an increasing human population growth that is demanding more and more wild meat, either for meeting their dietary needs or just for luxury in some cases. Like people from urban cities, they're demanding more and more this kind of food, and it seems like a luxury product. Apart from that, there's been a modernization of hunting techniques. People in the tropics are shifting from hunting with bow and arrow, and they're using now shotguns or rifles, and that means that they're more effective and efficient when hunting. And of course, they can hunt more pieces per unit time, more animals per unit time than using only bow and arrow. And that means that they are not only hunting for subsistence, so to actually feed their families, but also that the extra meat that they are acquiring, they are commercializing it in local and rural markets, but also in urban areas. For all those reasons, there's nowadays extraction rates are super high in the tropics, and they go up to 65 million animals per year across the tropics. And just in the Congo Basin, we're talking about 5 million tons animal per year, as you can see here in this graph by Young and others from some years ago. But not only in the Congo, as I mentioned, this occurs across the tropics and in other areas like Indonesia, the Amazon, Madagascar, and so on. Extraction rates are very high. But quantifying or estimating the impact of these extraction rates on animal populations, on their abundance, is quite complicated. And some years ago, I was discussing with my colleagues about the possibility of using this human accessibility as a proxy for hunting pressure. And why is this? Well, there are a number of studies showing that there's a clear relationship between the distance to hunters' access points, like roads and settlements, and hunting pressure. And this means that in the proximity of these settlements, because hunting pressure is higher, species density are normally reduced, and they become higher as we go farther into the forest to more remote areas, and over there they can approach again, carrying capacity. So with this idea on mind, a few years back, I decided to perform a literature review and a meta-analysis of all these studies showing this kind of patterns and trying to estimate what's the impact of hunting on mammal and bird populations, so by how much are populations reduced in hunted areas, but also how we can estimate those species depletion distances where species abundance are reduced. So I collected data from a large number of studies for many mammal and bird species, and what I did is transform this abundance data reported in the studies into this ratio, into this effect size that could be generalized across the studies, which is basically the ratio between the mean abundance in hunted areas and the mean abundance in control areas, so not hunted, for each species and each study. And this is a bit the geographic variation, or sorry, the location of the studies that I included in this meta-analysis. So what we found is the following. Here what you see is the distribution of all these response ratio or effect sizes. When these ratios are zero, because they are log transformed, it means that there's no change in abundance. Whereas where we have positive values, it means that the abundance increases, and negative mean that the abundances are decreased due to hunting pressure. And in the case of birds and mammals, you see there are some species that are positively affected, but most of them fall on the left side of this plot, and some of them are locally exit peri, like these species around here. Overall, what we found is that bird populations are reduced by 58% in hunted areas, and that in the case of mammals, this number is 83%, with a confidence interval between 70% and 90%. So a huge decline in the abundance of mammal populations in those hunted areas. We also related these response ratios with the distance to hunters' access points across all the studies. What you see here is on the left, the response ratio again, and below the distance. And the size of the points varies because it represents the precision of the studies in the meta-analysis. So overall, what we find is that species depletion distances are about 7 kilometers in the case of birds, but they go up to almost 40 kilometers in the case of mammals. So huge areas where mammal populations could be depleted by this activity, by this threat. So after performing these studies, I was left wonder, like, how can we use this information and couple it with other drivers of hunting pressure in order to predict defaunation patterns, so areas with reduction in abundance of mammals across the tropics, even in those areas where we don't have information. Whether we could find different patterns of defaunation for small species, medium-sized and large-sized species. For some of you that may be working with remote sensing and satellite images, you know that in order to quantify our deforestation rates across, well, in this case, I'm talking about the tropics, but let's talk about across the world. You can do it using this kind of techniques. You can track deforestation and land use change from the sky, let's say, and you can see these fishbone patterns that are very typical in areas like Rondônia in Brazil, where there have been massive deforestation rates in the past years. So here what you see is a typical road being built and then some small paths that are used by the logging companies to extract the wood. But in the case of hunting, it may occur in areas like this, where from the sky they look like undisturbed forests that they haven't been touched, let's say, by humans. But due to hunting, this forest could be empty. This is what Redford and colleagues coined as the empty forest syndrome. Basically, the idea that even in this forest that looks seemingly undisturbed, they could be actually devoid of mammal and bird populations, or they could be, these populations could be actually reduced, then rendering the forest half empty or empty. And also, I was triggered by the fact that there are some initiatives, some papers showing where intact forests and intact ecosystems are located across the world. On the left, you see the paper by Potapov and others, where they mapped intact forests across the world using remote sensing. And on the right, you see the Human Footprint Project, where in this case, the authors mapped areas under different impacts due to humans, based on also on remote sensing, but also on layers of night lights, crop lamps, road construction, and so on. But neither of these initiatives, neither of these great papers show, they didn't consider overhunting, they didn't consider the effect of hunting pressure, because it's really hard to quantify. So again, what I did is expand the database that I had for the previous study I showed before. In this case, I was focusing mostly on mammal species, for which I had more data. And then I couple these locations with spatially explicit information on different drivers that are related with hunting pressure. So I had the distance to rural settlements, which we know already that is a good proxy for hunting pressure, but I also included some other drivers like human population density as a proxy for the demand of wild meats. Also the travel time to major towns, which give us an indication of how close urban markets are where the meat and the body parts could be commercialized. Then I was also interested on understanding whether those communities, those poor communities that rely on wild meat, whether they would have a higher impact on mammal populations. And then I used the prevalence of stunting, which is malnutrition, as a proxy for poverty. And I also included food security, because the idea is that protein, maybe you wouldn't rely so much on wild meat. And finally, the protection status of the area. So this is a bit the modeling scheme that I use. I mean, you don't have to look too much on the little details, but basically what you have to know is that I couple those locations with the socioeconomic variables, and then I included some proxy of a species vulnerability to hunting, which is basically body size, under the idea of that larger species are not only preferably targeted by hunters, but they also have normally lower reproductive rates, and when they're hunted, it's more difficult for the populations to recover. And then I basically estimated on the one hand the local extirpation of species, or whether species were able to survive hunting pressure, and on the other hand, I estimated those abundance reductions I've been talking about. And then I combined both models in a harder modeling approach and projected them across all IUCN mammal ranges in the tropics and stacked them to produce hunting-induced deformation maps. In this case, what we did is to turn around this response ratio and back transform it to a normal scale. And then in this, we would have like a deformation index, which is a bit easier to process for, for us. And it's also easier to communicate. The idea is that then the deformation index, when it's really high, it means that the area is fully deformated. There are no more individuals of the population we're considering. And lower values indicate that the area is half or partially deformated. And we consider that 0.1 and below represent intact populations. So for the binomial part of the model, so looking at the probability of surviving extirpation, what we found is a clear relationship with the distance to hunters' access point. So again, the farther the populations, the more likely they are to survive hunting pressure, because probably the hunters don't get so far. And also we found a relationship with human population density. So the more people in the area, the less likely that they will survive local extirpation. Again, large size species seem to be less likely to survive local extirpation. And interestingly, we found that rural communities that are overall poor, that they have lower socioeconomic status, they are not the ones that are exerting the higher impact on mammal populations, but rather the richer communities are, probably because they are either hunting not only for subsistence, but also for recreational purposes, or they're using the meat for commercialization. Also what we found is that being in a protected area is favorable for surviving local extirpation. As for the abundant reductions here, what we did is to consider an interaction between body mass and distance to hunters' access points, which is what you see on the left. What you see is that smaller species, they're not affected by hunter pressure, and rather they have positive effects with increasing abundances in the proximity of hunters' access points. And this is because they are released from competition and predation by other species that are hunted by the hunters, and they are at reduced abundances. The populations are decimated, and therefore this means that rodents and other species can thrive in these areas. And again, we found that animal abundances are reduced in areas with high human population density. So these are the main predictors of the models, and then we projected them across the tropics, and this is what we found. So this represents a composite deformation map across almost 4,000 mammal species in the tropics, with body sizes ranging from the 0.01 kilograms to almost 4,000 kilograms. What you see in blue is areas that are intact or that are not defaunated, and in yellowish until red areas that have a high defaunation index. Overall, it looks like the picture is not very worrying, but what we can conclude is that at least 50% of the pantropical forest zone is under some degree of defaunation, which is 14 million square kilometers. And also that most of the species that are included in this map are small size species, which means that they are not affected by hunting. So if we go a bit deeper and then we look into what's happening with the medium size and large size species, we see that the patterns change quite dramatically with areas like West Africa, the Atlantic forest over here, mainland Asia, but also Indonesia being showing high defaunation index. And then what we see is that for medium-sized species, at least 60% of the area is under, of the populations living in these areas are defaunated to some degree. And in the case of large-sized species, this goes up to 80% of the pantropical forest zone, with a lot of species in this area of a defaunation index of 0.7, which means that they are reduced by 70% or more if we go to these areas. So we also decided to use this information, so try to pinpoint areas or where the defaunation index was really high for a large number of species, which is what we call hotspots of hunting-induced defaunation. And here, what you see from green to red is the percentage of species in those grid cells on those areas which have a defaunation index of 0.7 or more. And some of these areas I mentioned before, like West Africa, but also, Thailand and some areas in the Central America and so on. And these are home for some of the most traded species in the planets, like the clouded leopard, the tiger, and so on, and particularly the giant ground pangolin, which is one of the most trafficked species in the world. And actually, Asian pangolins are practically extinct or almost extinct. This is because they are heavily used in the traditional Chinese medicine, because those scales that you see here, they are used for several purposes. And what's happening now is that the African pangolins are being traded into Asia, into China for the use into Chinese medicine. Finally, we confronted our defaunation maps with those intact forest landscapes and human footprint areas that I was mentioning before. What you see is that if we look at across all the species, approximately 11 to 9% of the area, depending on whether we're looking to the Potapov project or the Human Footprint project. Well, this area is under some degree of defaunation, so it couldn't be considered intact. And if we focus again on large size species, this number goes up dramatically, with half of more of the intact forest landscapes holding populations of mammals that are quite reduced according to our models. Particularly here, the Congo Basin, you see that there are few areas that, as projected by our models, may be considered intact. Okay, so I'm going to move to the second part of the talk. Here, the idea is how to combine the effects of the two main drivers of defaunation into one analysis and see what's the relative importance of each other and how they are they can have synergistic effects or where they can overlap. So first I will talk about a paper that we published last year. This was led by Juan Zamorano from Radboud University, which is the institution where I was working before. And here we use the IUCN species ranges across the tropics and also their habitat and elevational preferences. And then we model, remember that my predictive models had the binomial and the continuous part. So we use the binomial part to model the probability of extirpation due to hunting pressure. And we quantified how these pressure have changed from 1992 to 2015. And estimated for all the species was the area lost by land use, the area lost by hunting, and the area lost by both effects combined. So what we found is the following: land use change. It continues to be the main driver of area loss in this case, because we're looking at how distributions are being shrunk by these two pressures. So most area loss is due to land use change. Hunting affects mostly those medium-sized and large-sized species that I was discussing before. And there are some areas where both pressures overlap. If we take the combined effect of both pressures, we estimate that species distributions across the tropics are reduced by 41% on average. And large-sized species are the ones that have their distributions more reduced due to both pressures. We also mapped these pressures across all species in the tropics to understand which areas they are affected mostly by hunting, like in the case of the lowest monkey, or if some other species are affected more by deforestation, like the spider monkey here, which is affected by pressure, but is super dependent on forest cover. So here you see some areas in purple where deforestation has occurred and the distribution of the species has been shrunk. And then in yellow, areas where the area within the distribution has been lost by both threats. And again, we stacked these maps to provide these cool spots and hotspots of cumulative area loss. We see that the Amazon basin is still quite intact according to these projections, but there are areas, for example, in the Atlantic forest and the Chaco area here, Colombia, and so on, that the area lost by the species living there has been quite high, and also in other areas like mainland China and Indonesia. I also collaborated in a project looking at this specific area here, the Chaco, which is one of the main forest frontiers in the world. And here, I worked with Alfredo Romero, who is based in Humboldt University, Berlin, to look at the combined effects of land use change and hunting in this area. This is the largest dry tropical forest in the world, with 1 million square kilometers. The forest is wetter in this area and becomes drier as we go farther south. And in the past decades, there's been a massive deforestation and conversion of forest for cattle ranching, but also for soybean expansion. And of course, a lot of hunting, either for retaliation. So for example, in the case of the jaguar, it could attack the cattle of the ranchers, and then some of them kill them, but also for food, for feeding, for food purposes. So here, in the previous paper, we used more a deductive approach, like understanding based on the IUCN habitat preferences how land use change could affect this species. But here we rely more on the data itself. We focus on the community of 48 large mammal species in the Chaco. This was a major collaborative project with a lot of people from Bolivia, Argentina, and so on, where we collected more than 27,000 presence points across the last decade for this mammal community, and built habitat suitability models using high resolution land cover maps. And then we also apply my hunting pressure models, but refined for the Latin American situation, and apply them for more than the 27,000 subsistence ranches in the area, which were used as access points together with roads. And this was also a major effort of georeferencing all these ranches. The idea was to estimate for each species these core areas where they could thrive, and those areas affected either by hunting, by poor habitat, let's say, because it has been converted, or by both threats together. And then stack this information per species across all them for 2 periods of time, 1985 and 2015, and see changes in both threats across all mammals. So we find the following. Above you see the impact of cattle ranching and land conversion, and below the impact of hunting pressure. You see that in the case of cattle ranching, most of the land conversion has occurred in Paraguay in the past 30 years, but also hunting pressure has become a bit larger across some of the roads and ranches that have been established here. And in general, we estimate that both footprints have been expanded across 40% of the entire Chaco in the 30 past years. If we look at these bivariate kind of maps that show where one threat is affecting and the other one is affecting, and in combination, we see that in yellow, these are the areas where hunting pressure was high back in 1985, and in blue, where there was poor habitat back in these years, like in this part in Bolivia, and also some areas in Argentina. And the major change has been, as I mentioned before, in Paraguay, where here there were some hunting pressure only, but probably these roads which facilitated access to hunters in the past, now they have been used to establish new ranches and to access the forest and convert it into pastures. And now we see that both threats are acting simultaneously there. We also looked at those species that are more affected nowadays by both pressures. And as you can see, these are the large carnivores, so the puma and the jaguar, but also some large ungulates like the deers and the peccary, or even the tapir, which is around here. Whereas some species have been only affected by hunting pressure, increasing hunting pressure, but not habitat destruction, such as the armadillos. And again, the change from one year to another, what we see is that habitat destruction has been larger than the expansion of hunting pressure, and it has affected mostly Paraguay, as I was mentioning before. It's important to note here that in Argentina, the effects are lower, but we know that a lot of the changes, land cover changes, land use changes, occurred back in the day, even before the 80s. So probably that's why we didn't pick the impacts in this country. Right. So with this, I move to the third part of my talk. And here, the idea is that, okay, we have seen how defaunation is profoundly altering mammal communities and also bird communities across the tropics. But how can these changes be affecting other species that depend on these animal species? And this is really important in the tropics because most of the species are being dispersed by animals. 80 to 90% of the tropical plant species It's true that in Asia, there are more species that are abiotically dispersed, and they are less relying on animals, but overall in the Afrotropics and Neotropics, most of them need these large frugivores to disperse the seed. So this was the natural next question in my investigation. And I'm going to explain very briefly how the whole cycle of recruitment from fruit to adult tree occurs. Usually what you have is a set of primary seed dispersals. Some of them are arboreal, and they handle the fruit and eat it and move the seed somewhere else. But some of the fruits are discarded or they fall, and then there are some terrestrial dispersers like the tapirs that can move the seeds somewhere else. Over there, when the seeds are deposited, some of them may be predated, like peccaries, and also rodents. And that means that there is a percentage of the seeds that are depredated. And in some cases, those same rodents, they don't eat the seeds immediately, but they move them somewhere else where they are buried. And this is what we know as secondary dispersal. They are scatter hoarded, and they could lead to seedlings eventually. And there's, of course, also dung beetles that depends on the dungs of large mammals. And they move the seeds in those dungs to somewhere else, bury them, and they could lead to seedlings. Once we are at the seedling stage, there could be some herbivores that feed on these seedlings, and that means that they could have a negative influence on seedlings. And this is what would happen in intact forest or in a forest holding an intact community of animals. But in the faunated forest, this may all change because some of the primary dispersers may be extirpated. Some of the seed predators may be at reduced abundance, like peccaries, because they are hunted, but others, like rodents and agoutis and so on, they may have an increased abundance because they're released from competition and predation. And in turn, dung beetles, because there are no large mammals, they may be reduced. And the herbivores, they may be also reduced because they are also targeted by hunters. So all this process may change dramatically in defaunated forests. So the idea is, okay, how can we compare these different stages across the plant cycle in intact versus defaunated forest to try to estimate the consequences of defaunation for forest regeneration? And then I've been collecting data for all these stages, for example, like the number of fruits removed, the visitation rate, the percentage of seed predated, seedling density, and so on, across a large number of studies in the tropics, again, using a meta-analytical approach. This is a bit the distribution of the studies I've found so far. As you can see, there's quite a higher number of studies in the neotropics compared to the other areas. And overall, what I've seen so far is studies looking at the establishment of seedling and saplings and less so in the other stages. This is an ongoing research, by the way. The preliminary analysis showed the following. Again, this is the response ratio comparing defaunated or disturbed forests with intact forests. Negative values indicate that there's a reduction of each of those variables you see here. And overall, what we find is that at all the stages, there's a reduction of the process of there's less fruit removal, there is less seed dispersal, there's also seed predation, counterintuitive, but I will discuss that later. Less secondary removal and less establishment. And if we back transform this value, to which again are log transform, if we back transform them to a normal scale, this implies that approximately there's a 40% to 70% decline of these processes in the faunated forest. But this is only part of the story. I'm still looking into this. And I'm also interested in knowing how dispersal distances may change in deformated versus intact forests. So according to the Jansen-Connell hypothesis, in non-deformated forests or in intact forests, normally seeds are dispersed farther away from the parent trees because most of the pathogens and predators attack the seeds that fall over here. And when they are dispersed, they escape this attack by negative agents. So we would expect that in half deformated forests that are lacking some of the main frugivores, or they only hold some of the medium-sized frugivores, that the dispersal distances are reduced, and that in deformated forests that a lot of the fruits and in turn seeds will fall under the parent tree and then being there attacked by pathogens and probably being non-viable in the long term. So I looked also into this, and what we're finding for now is the following. For both dispersal and establishment, most of the, well, in the case of dispersal, most of the seeds are found under parent trees in the deformated forest, and very few are found away from those parent trees. And for establishment of seedlings, we are finding again the same patterns. Finally, I would like to discuss another function that we looked into in a recent paper, which was published, well, here it says accepted, but it's already been published like a month ago. And this was a collaboration with Lika, who was in Pedro Jordano's lab with us working last year. And here what we looked at the changes in the abundance and richness of dung beetles in forests under hunting pressure, but also in fragmented forests with patch size being smaller than in continuous forests. And overall, what we find is that in very intensively hunted or even in light hunted forests, the abundance of dung beetles is lower, probably because those mammals that are supposed to deposit the dungs that they rely on are missing, and therefore the secondary dispersal services that these dung beetles provide are probably also decimated. And in the case of patch size, we also find that small fragments hold a much lower abundance of dung beetles than fragments with medium or large size. Right, so final question, which still for the long term is, okay, so if we are altering forest regeneration, the vegetation composition of tropical forests, what consequences this may have for carbon storage? And this is important because tropical forests store a large amount of the carbon in the planet. And as I've been talking about in my seminar, we are losing all those large size animals, those large frugivores that are able to handle and swallow large fruits, large seeds, and move them away and give help in the recruitment of new individuals or of large seeded species. And we know that there's a relationship between the seed diameter and root density. So the larger the species, the more likely is to store more carbon. So what we would expect is that in non-deformated forests with an intact community, we would have this kind of structure with large trees there, and that as large animals disappear, we would have this kind of forest where the carbon storage capacity would be diminished. And this is something that cleverly Carolina Bello, Pedro Jordano, Maro Valite, and others looked at a couple of years back in the Atlantic forest. And here what they did is to simulate the loss of large seeded trees because of extinction of frugivores, and compare this to random extinction across 31 communities in the Atlantic forest. And they see that when they have this non-random direct extinction of frugivores, in this case of large seeded trees, the carbon balance is reduced the more species are eliminated from the community. Whereas in the case of random extinction, there's no change in the carbon balance. And here they show more impactful change in carbon balance because of these extinctions. So this was done for Atlantic forest, and eventually in my career, I would like to see whether we can upscale this across the whole tropics and understand areas where biodiversity is high, functional diversity is high, and carbon storage is also high, if there are relationships there, or if there are mismatches, and how the loss of these important seed dispersers, important frugivores, may lead to a different picture that we see here, where carbon density is still high in the tropics. So to recap, what we have seen in the seminar is that human accessibility is a good proxy for hunting pressure, and that species of mammals, mammal populations and bird populations are reduced within the proximity of hunters access points. We have seen that according to our models, these are projected estimates, of course, but we could have like 60 to 80% of the pantropical forest zone under some degree of defaunation. That forest cover per se does not equal ecosystem intactness. So we could have forests that they look intact from the sky, but they're not. That land use and hunting have complementary effects, and they may act synergistically in some areas. And the defaunation may be altering profoundly forest regeneration across the tropics. I would like to acknowledge my collaborators from the Netherlands, from Spain, from Italy, United Kingdom, Germany, Bolivia, etc., Brazil. And of course, I would like to also acknowledge my current lab colleagues at the lab. It's a pleasure being working with them, and I'm learning a lot, and we are developing new projects that I hope to discuss in the next seminar. And with this, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I'll leave you here the main papers I discussed today, and also my contacts if you want to discuss ideas or criticize my talk or whatever you want to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Super great talk. So we have some questions, and I'm sure that more people are going to ask now. August Camacho, he's saying, thank you so much, Anna. Are there ways to test whether your estimates of hunting pressure and habitat suitability are accurate enough?
On what?
So he's asking about the accuracy of your models between hunting pressure and habitat suitability.
Yeah, the models are, I mean, that becomes too technical for a seminar, of course, but and all the models that I showed, the predictive models, are cross-validated, and the accuracy is good. I mean, it's not perfect because, again, we are trying to model a process which is super complicated, but it's good. And in the case of the habitat suitability model, it's a bit higher.
Okay. Maria Laura Tolmos, she says, thank you, Anna. Your work is super interesting. I was wondering if you know of any attempts to translate these findings into applicable policies to try and slow down, prevent deformation.
Yeah, indeed, that's the idea. Much of the work I've showed here is used in GloBio, which is a global biodiversity model developed by the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, with whom I've been working in the past 10 years. And there we use this information to produce global maps of biodiversity loss, current situation, and also projections to the future. And then we use this information to inform not only the Dutch government, but also platforms like EBD and other biodiversity assessment reports and so on. Also, for example, there's this initiative, the RED initiative, so reducing degradation and forestation in tropical forests. showing which ones could provide, they're good for storing carbon. And I would like to what I mentioned in the past slide, to see which areas are they should be preserved for biodiversity, they should be preserved for keeping carbon density, and which areas there are both of these metrics align, and where we can find mismatches, and why is this, and then use this to try to convince policymakers of the need of preserving these areas.
Okay, something that surprised me a little bit was that you presented a graph for a protected area versus non-protected area, and the hunting was quite high also in the protected areas.
Yeah. So the probability of surviving is higher inside protected areas, but yeah, indeed, even within protected areas, animals are being hunted. And this happens because there are a lot of settlements which are on the borders of protected areas, and some people enter illegally the reserves to acquire the food, acquire wild meat. And this happens because in many cases outside of the protected area, the populations are quite reduced already. You have this source sink kind of systems where the protected area act like a source, and then the hunters go in there to actually be able to hunt, basically to find animals which are close and not in very remote areas, because they have been decimating them for years. And of course, I mean, this also had to deal with protected area management and effectiveness, and the fact that some of these protected areas are underfunded. There's not enough patrol control because there's not enough staff to control the whole area. Well, it's really difficult to avoid or to limit the impact of poachers.
Okay, so Maria Laura is also asking, how long would you think that the deformation process will have visible results on plant diversity?
This is a very tricky question, because I mean, tropical forests take a long time to to regenerate, and some of these species are long-lived. It takes quite some time to become adult trees and so on. So we could find the signatures of these in the next 100 years or more, but in some cases, like what we see is that even trees that hold what we call megafaunal fruits, you know, like those fruits that could all be handled by megafauna that went extinct in the Pleistocene, they're still present nowadays as relicts from the past. In some cases, it's because they have found other dispersers that could handle these fruits, and in other cases because they are, as I mentioned, long-lived trees that are able to persist.
Okay, Carles Vila, he's asking you two questions. Thank you very much for a very nice talk. Very interesting that the stunting is inversely related to deformation. Could we do that because very high impacts in poor regions, but only over small distances?
Sorry.
Yeah, so that to very high, so because there are very high impacts in poor regions, but only a very short scale, a very short spatial scale, so over small distances. So the impacts are so local that they don't really affect the deformation.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, also because probably these people live in very remote areas where they don't have access to roads or to cities, and they cannot enter the market scheme. They cannot commercialize the meat, so they are basically just hunting what they need to secure the protein intake for their families. And that means that the populations that are hunting they are able to recover. The offtake does not surpass the production rate of the population. So this is why they're not being reduced.
Can I say something related to that? I was going actually to ask you, and it's very related to that. So I was thinking that maybe that's related because poor people typically hunt small mammals. So there are different areas, at least in Africa, where children that are starving, they access to rodents, for example, and that increases zoonotic disease and stuff. So I was going to ask you in relation with that, if you think that the cultural patterns are having an influence, like the differences in what they, like how they, who's hunting, what are they hunting, it makes generalization more difficult?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, like if when you want to hunt large species, normally you use or you need either more people, more infrastructure, better, let's say, better instruments. In this case, but if you want to hunt elephants, you need huge shotguns. You cannot go on your own, and you need to go with a huge number of people, and you need to be able to transport that. Well, normally they're being hunted for the ivory, but anyways, you need to transport it back, right? And yeah, it could be what you're saying, Mari, like in local communities, in poor communities, rural communities, they basically rely on what they find, and they eat indeed medium-sized to a small-sized species in some cases.
Yeah, actually, well, regarding that, I went to a talk, I was once in a talk where they were saying that elephants are never hunted for their food. And in South Africa, they are trying to make people to eat elephant.
Yeah.
So they are trying to convince that they can eat elephant.
Yeah, most of the studies that looked into hunting effects on elephants, indeed, what they were hunted for the commercialization. I didn't show it here today in the seminar, but in the paper from 2017, the meta-analysis, we looked at the impact of subsistence versus commercial hunting, and indeed, the impact of commercial hunting is much higher than subsistence. So yeah, what you're saying is absolutely right.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah. Also, Carlos is asking you about the map. I think he is referring to the first map. He says, the map for the hotspots of hunting-induced deformation was very green, low impact. Was that because you were including all body weights?
No, it's because here we were focusing, partly yes.
Can you put the map, please?
Yeah, I'm getting back to it, Irene, but it takes a while. The thing is that because here where we show is those species that are that have a deformation index of 0.7 or more, so 70% reduction or more. Let's see, we're almost there. Yes. So the deformation index of 0.7 or more, and what we represent is the percentage of species. So what you see in red is areas where 50% of the species in that cell or more are, have populations reduced by 70% or more. And of course, this includes also the small size species, which are not being hunted, or if they are, they recover very quickly, as we were discussing before. So they wouldn't account of a species with this deformation index of 0.7 or more. So this probably reflects mostly, probably no, it reflects large size species and probably some of the medium size species.
So Nacho, he says, Anna, this is an amazing data and analysis. I only wonder, how do you cope with all the bad news regarding species conservation? Anyway, thanks for documenting these patterns.
How do I cope with it?
With the bad news? How can you wake up every morning?
Cry at night every day? No. I don't know. I could ask the same to Nacho. How do you cope with the whole pollinator crisis?
Decline. Yeah.
A beer of a coffee and discuss it when you want.
I think also this motivates you for understanding better and trying to fight this. No?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, what motivated me, I didn't say it, but this was actually part of my master's thesis project back in 2007, where I look at the impact of roads, direct impacts, and then I was also looking at the indirect impacts of roads, which is, you know, this idea of areas becoming accessible and hunters going to hunt some species. And it was, you know, somewhere in a drawer during my whole thesis, and then I was able to pick it back 10 years later, and yeah, you know, what I'm saying is just I was with this bag in my head that okay, I have to do this because I think there's something big in here, and nobody has actually quantify at large scale the impacts of hunting in animal species. So yeah, so answering your question, yeah, it motivates me a lot, but it also makes me a bit concerned.
Nacho says to check with the insect decline, with the pollinator decline. So Georgie, she's asking, just wondering how much body size of a species is related to economic value of the species for a respective region. So local impact.
Yeah, that's very tricky because there are many aspects that for such a large scale analysis are impossible to capture. One of them is economic value. Normally large size species are preferable, but it has to do also with dietary preferences and the taste of the meat, or whether the species is not hunted for food, but mostly for commercialization of body parts. Also, a big aspect that we could include is culture and traditional beliefs. And there are some species, some primates that are not being hunted in Africa because they look like humans or something like that, and they have taboos. Also in Madagascar, they have something called fadi, and they don't hunt some of the species. And, I don't know, all these kind of things. And some of the species are preferably hunted not only because of the body size, but because for example, the feathers or the bones are used in some kind of ritual that is very locally performed in somewhere in Papua New Guinea. So of course there are a lot of nuances that are missing in the analysis, but the overall picture I think is there.
Yeah, okay. So Cayetano Gutierrez Canova, sorry. He says, many thanks, Anna, for the great talk. The results you presented here contrast with the recovery of many vertebrate populations in other regions like Europe. Do you think it's possible to implement conservation policies in low-income countries to promote less impacted activities, for instance, ecotourism, instead of hunting?
Yeah, I mean, of course, that would be ideal, but that would be the things that could be done. But it's very complicated, the easy answer. But yeah, in some areas, and also traveling around the world, I've been in places where some of the local guides used to be hunters, and now they work either accompanying bird watchers or, you know, for guiding tours for wildlife spotting. Because in the end, they are the best, and they know where the species are and which areas, which times of the day are better for spotting the species. But of course, this is not, this doesn't occur across the whole tropics. And we have still, on the one hand, we have areas where no British visitors come, and the communities still need to eat, or they need to buy products to build their houses or whatever. And they rely on the wild meat. And of course, we have the whole illegal wildlife trade business, which is one of the most profitable businesses in the world. After drugs, I think, and the commercialization of weapons, moving billions of dollars every year. So, I mean, you need to have coordination that transcend the local context and go to governmental level and coordination between at a transnational level as well. But you also, in some cases, for some people, you cannot just tell them you cannot hunt because it's part of their culture. They need it for feeding their families, and if you don't provide any other alternatives, yeah, this is you cannot do that. So yeah, very complicated issue.
Yeah, I will also say that in Europe also the hunting is a very lucrative also business, and I think it's part also of the increase of some vertebrate populations like deer and so on.
I didn't address the European case. The thing with the Northern Hemisphere and areas like the US and Europe and so on is that they have been regulated for many years now. So there are quotas, and there are hunting states where you need to be a member, and then you are allocated a certain amount of animals that you can hunt and so on. So it's different. And actually, you have animals that are reared in farms, and they are translocated into hunting states, so people. So it's a different business. Whereas in the tropics, of course, there are safaris, and of course, there are some Westerners there for what we call trophy hunting. But most of the hunting is for feeding purposes or for commercialization or for the wildlife trafficking.
Yeah, I think what you said about providing alternatives is key for that case.
The problem is that there has been a couple of papers looking at this alternative livelihood program. So basically the people raise poultry or they plant crops and so on, and they haven't shown very much success, this kind of program. So I think there's still a lot of work to do in that sense.
Okay, there is another question by Joji. She says in Southeast Asian tropical forests, there are many species that are dispersed by wind or abiotic factors, and there are also, did you see declines in large species? So I think she's asking about why also you find these patterns in Southeastern Asia, where also there is dipterocarpaceae forest with a lot of weight dispersed.
That's something I still have to look into. What you see here is resource for animal dispersed species. I forgot to mention that.
Sorry, can you repeat? It's for what? For
animal dispersed species. So even if they are in Asian forests,
okay.
These are being dispersed by animals. Something that I still have to look into is the difference between abiotically dispersed species, I wouldn't expect differences actually, and animal dispersed species, and whether there are geographic patterns in these results I show. As I said, this is ongoing research, so I'm still looking into these patterns. But as soon as I know it, I will share with you guys.
Okay, I don't know if Mari, do you want to ask anything else?
No, I don't have more questions right now.
I have my last question for you, Anna. It's about the rodentization of the fauna. So that is something that I don't know. This work by Rodolfo Dirzo, he's showing that there is a high abundance of rodents and decrease of other species, regardless of the size, because you can also find very big rodents. And have you found something different, something similar with your data? Or you didn't look really on that?
The graph I show here, let me see. Here, what you see here in blue, dark blue, light blue, these are species of small size, so normally rodents and so on, which are becoming more abundant in those areas that are being hunted compared to those species of larger body size. They're basically thriving in these areas because they're generalists. They are not being hunted in general, although medium-sized rodents are, as Mari mentioned before. But mostly they have very high reproductive rates and they can recover from pressure very easily. Because they are generalists, they basically don't have dietary restrictions or habitat restrictions. So when some of the large carnivores or medium-sized carnivores are removed from this area, there's no pressure on top of them, let's say, that keep their populations limited or regulated. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah, so you're finding the same patterns as well. Yeah, very worrying.
Yeah, that's a quick answer to your question. Yes.
Yes. So I think nobody else is asking in the chat. So thank you so much, Anna, for this wonderful talk. It was super long. I'm sorry for tiring you. Yeah, and next week we will have the seminar by David Quevedo. He's a PhD student at the EBD, so and it will be on Friday exceptionally, but we will announce that. So thank you so much. See you.
Thank you.